The savannah was silent, too silent. A small cub stood alone in the dark, wounded, starving and trembling, and around him the shadows moved. Somewhere in the tall, dry grass, something was watching him. His family had left hours ago, not because of a predator, not because of a flood, not because of war. They left because of him. His mother turned her back without hesitation. His brothers walked past without a single glance. Even the elder males of the Pride, the ones whose roar shakes the earth for 30 kilometers in every direction, looked right through him as if he simply didn't exist. He was the smallest, the weakest, the one who never fought for food, never wrestled with his brothers, never explored beyond the safety of the shade. While the rest of the Pride grew stronger every single day, he fell further and further behind. His name was Misfit, and by every law of nature that governs life on the African savannah, he should have been dead by now. This isn't a story about the strongest lion. It's not about the biggest coalition, the longest hunt, or the most brutal battle ever fought on these plains. This is a story about what happens when every living creature around you, including your own blood, decides that you are not worth saving, and what one small, broken cub decided to do about it. The answer will stay with you long after this video ends. If this kind of story is why you're here, hit that like button and subscribe. You're exactly where you need to be. Let's begin. The Luangwa River cuts through the heart of Zambia like a scar that never healed. For 6 months, not a single drop of rain had fallen. The riverbanks, once thick with green, had cracked into dry, pale earth, and the water had pulled back so far that the bones of animals from the last dry season were now visible in the mud. But life continued here. It always does. Along the northern bank, in the shade of a cluster of acacia trees, lived the Nsefu Pride, a family of 20 lions, 2 dominant males, several battle-hardened lionesses, and 6 newborn cubs born just weeks apart from 2 sisters who had chosen to raise their young side by side. The Pride was strong, disciplined, and feared across every kilometer of that riverbank. The 6 cubs were growing fast, and each one had already begun to show its character. 2 of them, twins, a brother and a sister, were the fastest of the group. Sharp-eyed, fearless, always the first to charge into a play fight and always the last to back down. The other 3 were not far behind, becoming stronger and more confident with every passing day. And then there was the 6th one, smaller than the others, always at the edge of the group, never in the middle of a fight, never chasing, never wrestling, never exploring. While his brothers tumbled over each other in the dust, he sat apart and watched. While they competed aggressively for milk, he simply waited. While they grew, he seemed to stay exactly the same. The researchers who monitored the Ensepho Pride gave him a name that felt almost too honest. Misfit. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the truth. He didn't fit. Not in the games, not in the hierarchy, not in the rhythm of a Pride that moved and breathed and hunted as a single living unit. But Misfit was alive, and something behind his eyes, something quiet and difficult to read, suggested that he was very much aware of everything happening around him. He watched the twins with a stillness that looked like fear, but felt like something more complicated than that. The dry season pressed harder every day. Water sources were shrinking, prey was moving to new ground, and the lionesses were hunting longer and returning with less. The cubs were left alone more often now, hidden in the tall grass, told to stay still and stay silent while their mothers disappeared into the dark to keep the family alive. For 5 healthy cubs, those nights were adventures. They explored, they wrestled, they pushed each boundary their mothers had set. For Misfit, those same nights were something entirely different. He stayed exactly where his mother left him, still, silent and small, while the world around him shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. Nobody paid much attention to that. Not yet. But the savannah notices everything, and something in the darkness of that dry, cracked riverbank had already noticed him. When the lionesses left to hunt, the savannah transformed. The same land that felt open and familiar under the afternoon sun became something entirely different in the dark. Deeper, louder, and full of things that moved without being seen. The cubs had been told to stay hidden, to stay still, and to stay silent until their mothers returned. 5 of them ignored every word of it within minutes of being left alone. The twins were the first to move. Bold and restless as always, they crossed the dry riverbed almost immediately, pushing into stretches of land that didn't belong to the Nsefu Pride. The other 3 followed, pulled by the same reckless curiosity that had been growing in them every day. Together, they turned the dangerous African night into a playground, chasing sounds, testing boundaries, and feeding off each other's confidence in the way that young animals do when they haven't yet learned what fear costs. Misfit didn't move. He stayed exactly where his mother had left him, pressed low against the cracked earth, ears flat, eyes wide open in the dark. Not because he was more obedient than the others, but because something in him already understood. In a way the rest hadn't learned yet that the night was not a playground. It was a place where the wrong decision didn't give you a second chance. What none of the cubs knew was that they were not alone out there. A female leopard had been moving through that exact stretch of riverbank for the better part of an hour, slow, deliberate, and silent, in a way that even the impalas grazing nearby had failed to detect. Leopards and lions share the same land, but exist as permanent enemies, locked in a rivalry that goes back further than any researcher can measure. And a leopard that finds a lion cub alone in the dark rarely walks away without doing something about it. She had no interest in the 5 cubs that were crashing through the bush, too loud and too grouped together to be an easy target. But one cub, alone, completely still, separated from everything that could protect him, that was different. She adjusted her direction and moved toward Misfit. The grass barely shifted as she passed through it. The night gave her everything: cover, silence, patience, and a target that wasn't running. Every step she took closed the distance between them, and the space between predator and prey had stopped being something that could be measured in meters. It was now being measured in seconds. Misfit sensed something before he saw anything. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was a change in the quality of the air around him. A stillness that felt wrong in a way he had no words for, only instinct. He pressed himself flatter against the ground and stopped breathing in the way that small, fragile creatures do when some ancient part of them understands that the next few moments will decide everything. The leopard was close now. She lowered her body, muscles loaded, eyes locked on the small shape in the grass ahead of her. Misfit had nothing. No brothers beside him. No mother within calling distance. No elder male whose roar could send a predator retreating into the bush. He had only stillness and the darkness and whatever luck the savannah was willing to offer a cub that everyone else had already decided didn't matter. Then something cut through the night, sudden, heavy, and coming from the water's edge, and it had nothing to do with mercy. It was a hippopotamus. One of the large bulls that patrolled the riverbank at night had come crashing through the reeds toward the water's edge, enormous and indifferent, unbothered by anything smaller than itself, which was nearly everything. The leopard froze, assessed the situation in the way that only a predator with true patience can, and then silently retreated into the dark. Not out of fear exactly, out of calculation. The opportunity was gone. She would find another. Misfit didn't know what had just happened. He didn't know how close it had been or what force had redirected the night away from the worst possible outcome. He only knew that the wrong quality in the air had passed, that his lungs were working again, and that he was still alive in a place that had not been designed with his survival in mind. He stayed flat against the ground until the sounds around him returned to something recognizable, and then he waited for his mother. She came back before dawn, along with the other lionesses, carrying the smell of blood and the exhaustion of a long hunt that had ended with a stolen kill rather than a clean one. The 5 adventurous cubs came tumbling back from every direction, loud, unharmed, and completely unaware of how fortunate their night had been. The mothers greeted them with the rough, efficient affection of animals that express love through action rather than tenderness. There was nudging, licking, the low rumble of recognition. The family reassembled itself the way it always did, organically and without ceremony. Misfit walked back to his mother and pressed his head against her side. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. There was no nudge, no rumble, no acknowledgement that he had been gone or that he had returned. He stood there for a long moment in that particular silence that is worse than rejection because it doesn't even rise to the level of a decision. He was simply not registered, not seen. The other cubs fed, wrestled, collapsed into sleep. Misfit sat at the edge of the group and watched them in the grey light before sunrise. The days that followed settled into a pattern that grew harder to watch with each repetition. The 5 healthy cubs were developing at a pace that made the gap between them and Misfit wider every morning. The twins had begun practicing coordinated movements, circling each other in mock hunts that were already showing the shape of real technique. The other 3 were building the social bonds that male lions depend on for survival, learning through play how to read each other, how to move together, how to establish a hierarchy that would one day define their place in the world. Misfit existed at the edge of all of it. One of the twins approached him once, genuinely curious, looking for a play partner. Misfit stepped back. The twin lost interest within seconds and returned to his brother. That was the closest Misfit came to belonging during those weeks, a single moment of proximity that he retreated from before it could become anything real. The elder males of the Pride had begun to allow the cubs near them, tolerating their presence and occasionally engaging with them in the careful way that dominant lions do when they are deciding whether a young animal is worth protecting. One by one, the 5 cubs made their way into that radius of acceptance. Misfit tried too. He approached slowly, head low, reading every signal. The males looked past him as if the space he occupied was simply empty. He returned to his mother and tried to feed. She stood up and walked away. Something was shifting in the Pride's relationship with him. And the savannah, as always, was paying attention. The Pride moved at dusk, as it always did, following a route the elder males had walked so many times that their paws found it without thought. The lionesses fanned out ahead, reading the wind, calculating distances, communicating in the subtle language of posture and glance that requires no sound. The cubs followed in the middle of the formation, protected by position, surrounded by family, carried forward by the momentum of 20 animals moving as one. All of them, except one. Misfit fell behind before the first kilometer was done, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone stopped to notice. He simply couldn't match the pace, his gait uneven and increasingly labored from an injury that nobody had paid enough attention to diagnose. He pushed forward, closing the gap when he could, losing it again when the ground changed or the pace increased. For a while he could still see them. Then the dark came faster than expected, and he could only hear them. And then he couldn't hear them either. The Pride was gone. He stood alone in the middle of the Zambian bush at night, injured, hungry, and completely exposed. No cover, no high ground, no familiar scent in any direction that told him which way safety was. He called out. The sound he made was small and carried nothing of the authority that a lion's voice would one day hold. It dissolved into the dark without an answer. He called again. The savannah returned only silence. What followed were the longest hours of his short life. Every sound became a threat. The distant laugh of hyenas somewhere to the east, the splash of something heavy entering the water behind him, the rustle of grass that could mean wind or could mean something low and patient moving through it toward him. He had no way to tell the difference and no option but to stay still and keep calling into the dark in the desperate hope that someone in his family would hear him and turn back. Nobody turned back, not his mother, not the elder males, not the twins who had once approached him looking for a play partner. The Ensepho Pride continued moving through the night with 19 members, and if any of them registered the absence of the 20th, they gave no indication of it. This is the part of nature that no documentary score can make comfortable. The clean, biological indifference of a family that has collectively, without meeting or deciding, concluded that one of its own is already gone. Misfit was not gone. He was standing in the dark, trembling, calling out with everything he had, and then something shifted in the grass to his left, close, deliberate, and moving without the carelessness of an animal that doesn't think of itself as a predator. He turned toward it. Two pale eyes caught the moonlight for just a fraction of a second before disappearing again. He wasn't alone out there. He had never been alone out there, and whatever was sharing that darkness with him had been patient enough to wait until the Pride sounds had faded completely before beginning to move in his direction. Misfit had survived the leopard. He had survived the rejection. He had survived hunger and injury and the particular cruelty of being invisible to the people who were supposed to love him most. But this was different. This time, there was no hippopotamus crashing through the reeds, no accidental rescue coming from the river. There was only him and the dark, and something that was getting closer with every breath he took. It was a young male leopard, not the same female from the first night, but a different animal entirely, newer to the territory, and still learning the difference between a manageable risk and a costly mistake. He moved through the grass with the particular confidence of a predator that had not yet been seriously hurt by anything, and Misfit, small and limping and alone in the open, looked like exactly the kind of opportunity that builds that confidence further. Misfit didn't run. His leg wouldn't allow it in any direction that mattered, and some part of him seemed to understand that movement would only accelerate what was coming. He stood his ground in the way that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with having no remaining options. The leopard closed the distance to less than 10 meters and stopped, reading him, deciding. The calculation was simple. The outcome felt inevitable. Then the night broke open. A sound came from the darkness behind Misfit, not a roar, not a full adult declaration, but something younger and angrier and completely unpredictable. 3 of the Ensepho Pride's adolescent males came crashing out of the bush, not because they had heard Misfit calling, not because they had been sent back to find him, but because they had been doing exactly what adolescent lions do, moving fast, making noise, burning energy without direction. They had stumbled onto the scene entirely by accident. The leopard made the only sensible decision available to him and disappeared. One threat removed, but what replaced it was, in its own way, just as dangerous. The adolescent males spotted Misfit, and their energy immediately redirected toward him. To them, he was not a Pride member in distress. He was something small and reactive and interesting, which to a young male lion with a full stomach and no outlet for his restlessness is essentially an invitation. They began to play with him. That word, play, does almost no justice to what it looked like from Misfit's perspective. They batted him, rolled him, pinned him with paws that already carried real weight behind them. He cried out, and they grew more excited. He tried to run, and they chased. Every attempt to escape only deepened his injury and prolonged the encounter. This went on until one of the adolescents bit down on his lower back with enough force to make Misfit go completely still, and the stillness finally broke the spell of the game. By the time his mother found him, guided back by sounds that had finally carried far enough through the night air, Misfit was barely standing. His back leg dragged. His coat was wet with saliva. He was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She approached him slowly, read his condition with her nose, and then stood over him. Not with warmth exactly, but with the quiet authority of an animal reclaiming something that belonged to her territory, if not yet her heart. She didn't let him feed that night, but she didn't leave him either. She stayed close enough that nothing else would approach, and Misfit pressed himself against her flank and breathed in the only scent in the world that had ever felt like safety. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love, but it was something. And for a cub that had been running on nothing for days, something was enough to make it to morning. The morning after is always honest. Whatever the night allowed you to pretend about strength, about belonging, about how much further you could push before something gave way, the morning removes it. Misfit woke stiff and slow, his back leg worse than the night before, his body carrying the full accounting of everything the last several days had cost him. But he woke up. And in the particular mathematics of the African bush, that still meant something. He didn't try to integrate with the group that morning. For the first time, he didn't approach his brothers or attempt to press into the space near the elder males. He didn't follow the twins when they moved, or position himself near his mother, hoping she would acknowledge him. He simply existed alongside the pride at a distance that asked nothing of anyone. And something about that shift, subtle as it was, seemed to change the texture of the air between him and the rest of the family. His mother watched him more that day, not with warmth, not yet, but with attention, the specific attention that a lioness gives to something she is in the process of reassessing. Scientists who study maternal rejection in lions describe it as one of the least understood phenomena in large feline behavior. A mother can withdraw completely from a cub that she carried, delivered, and fed, apparently reclassifying it from offspring to irrelevance based on signals that researchers are still working to decode. But that reclassification, it turns out, is not always permanent. Misfit moved differently now. The injury had taken something from him physically, but it had replaced it with something harder to name, a kind of deliberateness, a quality of presence that hadn't been there before. He stopped hesitating at the edges of things and started simply occupying whatever space was available to him, quietly and without apology. He couldn't run with the others. He couldn't wrestle or chase or do any of the things that built standing in a pride of young lions, but he could endure. And he did it in plain sight, without retreating into invisibility the way he once had. The pride moved to the river that afternoon, following the elder males to a narrow crossing point where the banks were low and the current was manageable. The crocodiles were there, as they always were, ancient and still and almost indistinguishable from the dark water around them. The lions knew the safe line and followed it, the adults crossing first, the cubs moving in the middle of the group, where the collective presence of the pride made even the crocodiles calculate twice before committing to anything. Misfit reached the crossing last. His bad leg made the footing difficult, and he chose his steps with a carefulness that slowed him further. His mother had already crossed. She stood on the far bank and watched him approach the water's edge. He tested the first step, found it unstable, adjusted. A crocodile, 15 meters downstream, had been still for so long it looked like part of the riverbed. Then it didn't. It moved toward Misfit with the sudden, terrible efficiency that makes crocodiles one of the most effective ambush predators on Earth. Misfit saw it and froze. The same freeze from the first night, the same complete stillness. But this time, his mother saw it too. And something in her that had been calculating the cost of this cub against the demands of survival stopped calculating entirely. She was back in the water before the crocodile closed half the distance. She hit the water at full speed, and the crocodile, experienced enough to know the difference between a cub with no backup and a lioness with nothing left to lose, veered away at the last possible moment, its massive tail sweeping an arc through the shallows before it submerged and disappeared. The river settled. The crossing point went quiet, and Misfit stood at the water's edge, completely still, watching his mother wade back toward him through the current. She reached him and did something she hadn't done in weeks. She pressed her head against his and held it there. Not briefly, not with the mechanical efficiency of an animal performing a function. She stayed, and Misfit, who had been running on the fumes of pure stubbornness for longer than any cub his size should have been able to, pressed back against her with every ounce of weight he had and didn't move. The other members of the pride watched from the far bank without intervening. There is a particular silence that falls over a group of animals when something is happening that even they seem to recognize as significant. This was that silence. The elder males, the twins, the other cubs, the aunts who had walked past Misfit for weeks without acknowledgement. All of them still, all of them watching, as if the river had briefly become a stage and they had understood their role was to be the audience. His mother guided him across. She stayed on his weak side, positioning her body between him and the current, moving at his pace rather than her own. It was a small thing in isolation. In context, it was everything. A lioness who has withdrawn from a cub doesn't do this. A mother who has reclassified her offspring as a lost cause doesn't wade back into crocodile water and then restructure her movement around his limitations. Something had crossed back over with Misfit, and it had nothing to do with the river. They reached the far bank together. Misfit was shaking from the cold, from exhaustion, from something that had no clean biological category. His mother stood over him while he recovered, and when one of the adolescent males drifted too close with the wrong kind of interest, a single look from her was sufficient to redirect him entirely. She was not reassessing anymore. She had decided. For the first time in longer than the researchers monitoring the Ensepho Pride could precisely calculate, Misfit fed, not after everyone else had finished, not from whatever remained at the edge of a kill that had already been stripped. He fed alongside his mother in the space she created for him, while his brothers moved around them and the afternoon sun dropped toward the tree line and the Luangwa river ran slow and brown behind them all. He was still the smallest. His leg still dragged when he walked. He was still, by every observable measure, the weakest member of the Ensepho Pride. But weakness and being done are not the same thing. Misfit had always known that. It had taken his family considerably longer to learn it, and the savannah, which forgets nothing and rewards very little, had watched the whole thing without comment, the way it always does, and simply continued. The days that followed were not a transformation. That would be the wrong word for it, and this story has earned the right to more honest language than that. Misfit didn't suddenly become the strongest cub in the Ensepho Pride. He didn't overtake the twins, or earn a dominant position among his brothers, or perform some act of spectacular courage that rewrote how the Pride saw him. The leg healed slowly, imperfectly, leaving him with a gait that would likely never fully disappear. He was still last. He was still small, but the nature of his being last had changed in a way that made all the difference. His mother stayed close. Not every hour, not with the kind of constant hovering that would have been its own problem, but consistently enough that the rest of the Pride recalibrated around it. When a family's matriarch repositions herself relative to a specific cub, the rest of the group reads it and responds. The adolescent males gave him more space. The elder males allowed him closer than before. Even the twins, who had always existed in their own sealed world of speed and competition, began occasionally slowing their pace when Misfit fell behind on the move. None of them made a decision about this. That is the thing about belonging. It rarely arrives as a declaration. It arrives as a series of small adjustments, each one barely visible on its own, that accumulate over time into something that looks, from the outside, like acceptance. One morning the Pride moved out across the dry plain, and Misfit moved with them, not at the edge and not at the back, but somewhere in the middle, carried forward by the momentum of a family that had, without announcement, made room for him. The researchers who documented the Ensepho Pride during this period noted something in their records that doesn't fit neatly into the standard frameworks of lion behavior. Misfit had survived circumstances that should have ended him multiple times. Predator encounters, injury, maternal rejection, isolation, hunger. Each of those alone carries a mortality rate that makes survival statistically unlikely. Together they form a sequence that, by the numbers, should have had a different outcome. And yet the data kept recording the same result. He was still there. What the data couldn't record was the quality of his stillness in dangerous moments, or the particular stubbornness with which he kept closing the distance to a family that kept moving away from him, or the way he had stopped performing for acceptance and started simply existing within whatever space was available, and how that shift, invisible and unannounced, had been the thing that finally changed something in the pride around him. The Luangwa River was still shrinking. The dry season had no intention of ending on anyone's schedule. The Ensepho Pride still had enemies, still had hungry nights, still had the full weight of the African bush pressing against them from every direction. None of that had changed. What had changed was that when the Pride moved, there were 20 sets of paws on the ground instead of 19, and the 20th set, uneven and unhurried, left marks in the dry earth the same as all the others. The savannah keeps no records of the animals that survive against the odds. It doesn't mark the spot or note the date or hold anything back for the ones that earned it. It simply continues, vast and indifferent and breathtaking. And the ones who are still moving through it carry their own proof. Misfit was still moving, and in the end, that was the whole story. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The next story is already waiting.